Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows Compiler. Today we will look again at the form in our application and allow information to pass from the grid to the editable fields. This was our application at the end of the last video. We have created a form in our application to allow the user to enter information. This information on new starts in the organization, once submitted, is saved into this grid. Currently, we are only storing 3 pieces of information on the grid: the name, the department, and the start date. There are 3 additional pieces of information we're not currently storing. And that's one of the things we're going to do today. We're going to increase the number of columns in our grid from 3 to 6 to store all of the information on the form. Additionally, we're going to allow our users to double-click on the list view. When done, this will populate all the fields on the form. This will set the stage for allowing the user to edit information that has been previously submitted. So let's go and have a look at the code to see how we can achieve all of this. Currently, at the beginning of our application, we have an entry which sets the maximum number of columns in the list view grid. We're going to increase this from 3 to 6. Additionally, I want to set up an enumeration to allow us to number the columns in the list view. This technique we've used in previous videos. It allows us to set up a constant for each of the columns, which can be referred to in code as constants, as in the %sign lv column dot title, which when compiled would return the value 1. In other words, the first column in our list view. This has 2 advantages. It makes it easy should at some point in the future we wish to reorder the columns, and secondly, it makes our code more readable. So we will later go through the rest of our code and change any reference to column numbers to use these constants. So first, let's go to the function which creates the form so we can set up our 6 title headers. In here, we currently specify the column names as a name, department, and start date, and we're also using column numbers. So we're going to amend these numbers to substitute the enumeration constants. And additionally, we're going to add 3 extra columns. 1 for the title, 1 for the age, and 1 for the working pattern. And there we are. I've adjusted the width of some of the columns to allow them to fit better into our screen. So we now have 6 columns. Since we're going to have 6 columns, the CSV file we've currently got on disk, we're going to erase so we can create a brand new one. If we run the application now, we will see our application now has more columns. However, we don't have any data in the columns yet, so let's add our first line of data. And there is our processing running. And there is our first line of data. Notice that the list view grid now has a scroll bar, horizontal, to allow us to move from left to right so we can see all the information. It has done this on its own without us having to add any additional code. However, as we can see, the information is not going into the right columns, so we're going to have to amend some code to allow it to go into the correct columns. So we will remove our CSV file once more. So the data is put into each of these columns when the user clicks the Submit button. So we now have to go to the callback function, the event handler for the form. And then here is a section which handles clicking on the Submit button. And here we have the event that handles clicking on the Submit button. Once we have displayed the processing progress bar, we then attempt to get the user data from the screen. So we're currently getting the name of the user and the department. We have to add to this to pull back the title and the age. So we have now added title and age to our list of control get text commands. The other value we need to pull from the screen is the working pattern. As you will remember from previous videos, the working pattern is multi-select. This list view allows the user to select more than one field. In order to determine the working pattern, we're going to make use of a function we created in a previous video, which is getListBoxValues. This takes two parameters, being the handle of the dialog and the handle of the control in which this information is stored. This will return a comma-delimited list of values, and we're putting that into our working pattern variable, which is new, and we will need to declare at the beginning of our function. And there we have variable declarations for both our working pattern and also our title. So now that we have our extra fields, how are we going to put those into the grid? There's already a section of code which handles population of the list view, and we're going to make a few changes in here. Currently, the first item is to insert the name. Our first column, we now know, is going to be the title. So we're going to amend this, and there is our first column being title. Now, for the population of the remaining columns, we'll need to change this as well to add on our extra fields and substitute our constants for these hard-coded numbers. And in here, I'm using the prefix command to save a little bit of typing and also to make our code a little more readable. So we're doing a ListView set text for each of these fields: the name, the department, the start date, the age, and the working pattern. Our final entry in here is to replace these hard-coded column numbers with our constants. And there are our hard-coded values replaced by the constants. These constants will be replaced at runtime with the actual numbers. Having these constants in the code makes it much easier should we decide at some point in the future to change the order of the grid. So let's run the application once more and see how it's performing. So we'll put a new entry in. And we're going to select a working pattern for shifts 2 and 3. And we will hit the submit button. So processing progresses, and after it's completed, we should have our grid populated. Now we have the name, the title, the department, the start date, and the age and the working pattern all in the correct columns. Having submitted the form, the data will now be saved to the CSV file. So we come out and have a quick look at our CSV file. There is our CSV file, and there is the information. It's now picking up all 6 fields. So if we run the application once more from the executable, we'll see that the information is not populating these extra fields yet. So there's one more piece of code we'll need to change. And that is what happens when the form is loaded. So when the form is loaded, we're calling a function called populate ListView. This reads the CSV file into an array and then empties out the list view and then repopulates it. So again, we're going to make some changes here to add in our extra columns and to amend the hard-coded column numbers to our constants. So our first task is to use the insert item, but this time on the title field. However, there is something additional we can do in this section of the code, and that is to fit the column widths to the data in our list view. This can be quite easily done within a for next loop. We're going from the first column to the last column in our grid, and we're using a command called ListView fit header. You will see in the help file that ships with PowerBasic that you have 2 options here. You can use ListView fit content or ListView fit header. If you use the content option, then the column width is adjusted to fit the width of the data items displayed in that column. This command makes no account of the width of your header. However, the header command takes into account the width of both the header and the data within the column. So I generally use the ListView fit header. That way, if the header is wider, the column is as wide as the header. If the data within the column is wider, then the column adjusts to fit that. So once we declare this new local variable and run our application once more, we will see that the width of each of the columns is now quite dynamic. So they generally take up less room. And if we add someone with a long name, and then click Submit, we'll see initially the entry has not been adjusted. However, if we exit and come back in again, we'll see that it now has. So there is one more place we'll need to actually run this small for next loop, and that is when the Submit button is clicked to populate our grid. So let's go back to the code and put that in. So we're going to copy this section of code here. And in our event handler, after we have actually populated the list view, we're going to run this code once more. Once the column is populated, it will recalculate the width of each of the columns. So let's just check to see if we have a column variable defined in here. No, I don't think we have. Therefore, we will declare it at the top. And if we run our application once more, we want to add in an even longer name. And click Submit. Oh, and start date in, of course. It will run the processing and then add to our grid. And we should find the name column has been expanded to fit the data we have put into it. So our list view control as a grid is now quite dynamic. So now that we have all that in place, what do we have to do to allow the user to double-click on our grid? The requirement is to allow the user to double-click, and once double-clicked, all the data within this row highlighted should go into the rest of the fields. So let's go back to our event handler, our callback function, to see where we can put that code in place. So in our event handler, we already have this set up. This is to allow us to handle notifications sent from controls to our callback function. And if we look further down in the code, we'll see there is already a notify event for both the rich edit control and the start date. So we're going to add to this to allow us to handle notifications from our list view grid. So beneath this section, we're going to create a new case statement. So here is our new case statement, working on our list view staff grid. And the event we're looking for, in this case, is a double click. So we're going to have to add a couple of variables at the beginning of this function. And these are one to allow us to identify the item which has been clicked upon. This will be the row number. And the second is this, which is a pointer, which, as you will see in a moment, we will use to identify what's been done. So first of all, we're going to populate our pointer by using the L parameter of our callback function. And then from this, we can pick up the item that has been clicked upon by using our pointer and then item. Populating the clicked item, there is one thing you have to take into consideration. This is effectively returning the row in the list view. However, the rows count from 0. If the value within our clicked item variable is greater or equal to 0, then the item has been clicked. So just to prove this has happened, we're going to throw a message box up on screen, just to allow us to debug this section of the code. So let's try running the application now to see if what we've done effectively picks up the row that has been clicked upon. Well, there is our grid populated. So let's click on the first data row. And our message box is showing the double-clicked item is the index 0. Remember, as I said, the rows are counted from 0 onwards. So let's pick the next one. This is returning the value 1, and the final data row is returning the value 2. If we click on a row that has not yet been populated, nothing is appearing on screen. If we double-click on the header row, again, nothing is appearing on screen. Only if one of the data rows is double-clicked upon do we get a value. So let's go and put the rest of our code in. So we will comment out the message box as this was only for debug purposes. And we're going to add in a new function. This function will have the task of populating the rest of the fields from our list view. So we're passing some parameters. The handle of the form, the handle of the data grid, and the item number that the user has actually clicked upon. So here is the skeleton of our new populate form function with its 3 parameters. The purpose of this function is to populate the rest of the form from the list box. Therefore, as you can guess, we're going to need some local variables. And here they are. We have a variable for the column. We're creating a data array to hold the form data. An item for the combo box or list box, a variable for the department, a counter for working patterns, as an individual user may have more than one working pattern, a total working patterns for the user, the actual individual working pattern, and the current starting date. So the first thing we need to do within this function is to look at the value passed in the clicked item variable. As we saw, the value returned from the double click starts from 0. Therefore, as the rest of our code, the numbering of the rows starts from 1, the first thing we'll do is to increment the clicked item variable. This is easily done using the increment command. Next, we're going to populate our data array from the list view. Next, we're going to use a for next loop. This is looking at each of the columns in the row the user has selected, and we're pulling the information out of each cell within this grid row. And we're populating our data array with those values. Next, we're going to set the text fields on the rest of the form. These can be quite easily done using Control Set Text, and again I'm using the prefix command to save a little typing. And in here you can see we're also using the enumerations for the columns, which makes our code quite readable. So we're populating the title, the name, and the age fields. Next, we're going to handle our combo box, our drop-down list. This is for the department. This takes 3 separate commands. One to unselect any value currently held within that drop-down list. We're then picking up the department value from our data array. We're then using the combo box find exact command. This will find an item in the drop-down list that exactly matches the value taken from our list view. That will return an item number. This is the item number in the drop-down list. If that number is greater than 0, then we have found an exact match. And we can use the combo box select command to select that item on the drop-down list. As these drop-down lists only have single item select, this will work quite nicely. Next, we have to do the working patterns list box. As it's a multi-select list box, this is a little more complicated. As before, the first thing is to unselect any values that have already been selected. Then we're using the total patterns to do a parse count on the number of items within the working pattern in our data array, using the comma as delimiter. So that way, if there's one value, then we're working from 1 to 1 in the for next loop. If there are 5 patterns, it would be from 1 to 5. And then we're using the parse command to pull the information out of our array, one working pattern at a time. And then we're looking for the exact match, just as we did on the combo box, for the pattern that we have found, populating the item variable. If we do find that pattern, then we're selecting it on the list box, and we're running through the next item in the working pattern for next loop. So if the user has no pattern selected, then nothing will be selected. If they have one or more, then that will be matched in the list box. Our final task in this function is to set the start date. Up until now, we haven't differentiated between the UK date format and the US date format, so we're going to do that now. So right at the beginning of our code, we've got a new constant called date format. I've put this in as UK. If you need to use the US date format, then all you need to do is to change UK to US. And we'll use that throughout the rest of our application. So let's go back to that function and set our start date. So as before, we're going to populate our start date from our array which pulled the information out of the column our user has populated. If the start date is 0, then we want to use the current start date. And we're using a function in our date library, which takes the single parameter, which is the date format, and this will return the current date. If we have a look in our library, we'll see it's a very simple function. It takes the single parameter in. If this is UK, it will call another function which pulls back the current date. Otherwise, it will use the inbuilt date dollar function. And the UK one merely uses the date dollar and chops that up to reformat it in UK format. The next line of code is a function called setAdate. Now, we already have that function in our program. However, we're going to add the extra parameter to it, which is going to be the date format. And this will set the date on our date control. So let's go to the setAdate one and make changes in there as well. This will need its extra parameter. And there is our extra parameter on the parameters list. We are, of course, going to have to change this section of code down here to be aware of our date format variable. And there are our changes. If the date format is US, we're pulling the month out as the first two characters. Otherwise, we're using the middle characters. The other change we'll need to make is to an existing function called clearEntries. It is also calling the setAdate function. And we'll need to pass in the date format and change this line of code to pick up the current date. And there are our changes to this function. So have we now done enough to allow our application to operate quite smoothly? Let's try running it and find out. So there we have the existing data in the form. So if we double click on one of the entries, for example, one of the ones with 2 shift patterns, if we double click on that, we'll see that the title, the name, and the age have been populated, the department has been selected, and the working pattern has been selected for 2 shift patterns. If we look to see one has only 1 shift pattern, if we double click on this one, it will be displayed and only shift 3 is pre-selected. And let's put a new one in with a different start date, just to prove that bit works as well. What we don't, of course, have is anything to blank all this out to allow us to set a new one in. So let's just make a few simple changes. And we'll change this start date to sometime in April and submit that. It will attempt to process. And once processed, it will put the new entry in at the top. So there we have one with a different start date. If we double click on it, it will be populated at the top, and it's quite happily picking up the dates. However, there are a few more things to do in here, which we'll do in the next video. If we attempted to edit this one to change, for example, the department that this user is going to be in, and click to submit, it would process quite happily, but it would put the entry in as a brand new entry. It would not edit the existing one. So we now have two Fred Smiths. So if we're going to keep this as a running total of all the users working for this organization, then we'll need to find a way of uniquely identifying each of the users in the list view so that when they're edited, they can be edited cleanly without putting in a duplicate entry. However, as I said, we'll leave that for the next video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching today's video. Please feel free to click on the link in the description below to discover more videos.